Wyoming Territory, 1887. The wind cut sharp over the sagebrush hills as Sheriff Abram Northwood drove his spade into the dry dirt, the grave marker leaning crooked behind him. Wrong name, wrong year, but something in his gut told him to dig. The sun was just tipping over the horizon, throwing long shadows through the cemetery. Abram leaned into the shovel again, sweat already dampening the collar of his shirt. He had not planned to be here today. He had come for his mother's grave she had passed 3 years ago, and someone had reported that her locket was missing from the box buried with her. He had not expected to find another grave entirely. The marker read, Sariah Elsden, 1886. No birth year, no family name. Just a shallow grave in the weeds behind the church, no more than 4 feet deep. That was what drew his eye. No one buried a body that shallow unless they were in a hurry. He hit wood. Then he heard a sound, a scratch, a gasp. Abram froze. The shovel dropped from his hand. Another scratch. Then fingers, pale and clawing, broke through the dirt between the cracks in the wood. "Help me," a voice rasped, hoarse and dry. "Please." He fell to his knees and tore the boards open with his bare hands, splinters cutting into his skin. Inside the box, caked in dirt and barely breathing, was a woman. Mud streaked her face, her lips cracked, her eyes wide with terror and confusion. Around her neck hung a silver locket, his mother's locket. Abram reached in and lifted her out, stunned by how light she was. Her body trembled against his chest and her breath hitched. "You're all right," he said, steadying his voice. "You're safe now." She blinked up at him, her brows pulling tight. Who are you, Sheriff Abram Northwood? Who are you?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then faintly, Sariah Elsden." She passed out in his arms. He carried her straight to Doc Merrick's, kicking open the door with his shoulder. Doc looked up from his desk, startled. "What the hell?" "I dug the wrong grave," Abram said. "She was buried alive." Doc took one look and sprang into action, clearing space on the table and barking for towels and water. Hours passed. Abram stayed. Later, when she woke again, she was quiet. Her voice was stronger but still raspy. She would not say much, only that she remembered being grabbed on the road north of Laramie. A wagon, a man's voice, the smell of chloroform, then darkness, then dirt. When Abram asked about the locket, she looked down at it, confused. "I do not know how I got this," she whispered. "But it was here when I woke up." He stepped closer, heart uneasy. "That belonged to my mother. Her grave's just over from where you were put." Sariah's eyes filled, but she said nothing. He took her to his house that night, refusing to leave her alone. The sky was heavy with stars as she sat on his porch, wrapped in one of his mother's old quilts. Abram brought her tea, the steam curling between them. "I do not know who would do this to me," she said softly. "I do not know if someone is still out there looking to finish it." "You will be safe here," Abram said, leaning beside her. "No one's going to hurt you again." She turned her head, studying him. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to. I saw you in a grave, breathing." "That is enough," her eyes shimmered. "You dug me out with your own hands." "I would do it again," he said, voice low. Something shifted between them. She looked away, but her hand reached out and rested lightly on his. Days passed. Sariah stayed close, healing slow. Abram learned she had no family left. Her parents had died of fever in Kansas. She had been traveling west, hoping to find a place in Cheyenne. She was 22, alone. Until now, he had not meant to fall for her. It happened in quiet moments, her laugh when she fed his old hound, the way she folded his shirts after washing them, the soft way she said his name when he brought her wildflowers from the hills. "You do not have to keep me," she said one evening, standing in his kitchen, flour on her hands. "You have done more than enough." Abram stepped closer, took her hand in his. "I want you here," he said, steady. "I want you with me." Her eyes searched his. Then she leaned in, resting her forehead against his chest. "I feel safe with you," she whispered. "I have not felt that since before everything went wrong." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "I will never let anyone bury you again," he said. She laughed, a soft, broken sound. "I would like to stay." One night, a week later, she came to him. Her hair was down, her eyes clear. She stood by his doorway, watching him as he lit the fireplace. "Abram," she said. He turned. She stepped into the room, barefoot on the wooden floor. "I keep thinking about that moment when you pulled me out. And I do not know how to explain it, but I knew I was not alone anymore." He crossed the room slowly, his chest aching with how much he felt for her. "I have not been alone since I met you," he said. "I do not want to be." She reached up, cupped his face. "Then do not be." He kissed her, and it was not rushed, it was right. Her hands tangled in his shirt, his arms around her waist. Outside, the Wyoming wind blew gentle across the hills. They slept in each other's arms that night, her head on his chest, his hand in her hair. Neither of them spoke of love yet, but it was there, strong and growing. And for the first time in a long time, Abram Northwood dreamed of a future that did not end in loss. He dreamed of her. That spring, the snow melted late. It left the hills soft underfoot, and the creek near Abram's pasture running fast and loud, pulling bits of broken ice down from the mountains. Sariah stood by the fence one morning, watching the water rush past. The hem of her dress was damp with dew, her boots half sunk in the mud, but she didn't seem to care. Abram leaned on the gate a few paces back, arms folded. "You've been out here a while." She didn't turn. "I used to think water only ran clear in stories." Her voice was quiet, not sad, just wondering. "Kansas creeks were always brown." He stepped beside her, silent for a while. The smell of wet wood and thawed earth moved between them. "I know a place," he said, "about 4 miles west. Pools deep enough to swim in, even got fish you can see all the way to the bottom. I could take you if you want." She looked at him then, sharp and searching. "You trust me to leave town with you?" "I'd trust you with my horse," he said. "Figure that says plenty." Her smile came slow, the first one in 2 days. They rode out after noon, her on the mare he'd trained himself, a sturdy dun with a calm gait. She handled the reins steady, like she'd done it her whole life. Abram kept to her left, letting her set the pace, the sun warm on their backs. They didn't speak much. The land stretched quiet around them, cottonwoods just starting to bud along the creek, prairie dogs skittering into burrows as the horses passed. About an hour in, Sariah slowed her mare and pointed westward. "There," she said. "Some kind of rock overhang." Abram nodded. "That's the place." The pool was nestled in a bend of the creek, clear and still, shaded by a curve of stone. Willow branches dipped low over the water, and the only sound was the distant rush of current and the shift of leather as they dismounted. Sariah stepped to the edge, crouched, and ran her fingers through the water. Her eyes closed for a moment. He dropped to one knee beside her. "You all right?" She didn't answer right away. Then there was a moment in that box. "I thought this was the last thing I'd ever feel, dirt under my nails, cold air in my throat." I didn't remember my own name, but I remembered this, the feel of water, how it runs around your fingers. He didn't move, just listened. She looked at him, eyes clear. "You gave that back to me." He reached for her hand, not hesitating. "I'd give you more if I could." Her fingers curled into his, and she let out a breath she'd been holding too long. They stayed that way, hands clasped, until the sun dropped lower and the shadows thickened under the trees. On the ride back, she leaned toward him once, resting her hand lightly on his thigh for balance as they crossed a shallow stream. It stayed there longer than needed. 2 days later, a man arrived in town. Abram saw him first, stepping off the stage with a carpetbag slung over one shoulder and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low. He was lean and pale, with a limp on his left side and a scar bisecting his upper lip. Abram watched from the sheriff's office as the man paused, looked around, then headed straight for the general store. Inside, Sariah was buying flour. Abram didn't wait. He crossed the street and pushed through the door just as the man stepped in behind her. She turned, stiffened. The man froze. "You," he said. Abram moved between them. "You know this man," her voice came low. "He drove the wagon." The man's jaw twitched and his eyes flicked toward the door. Abram didn't give him the chance. He hauled him out by the collar, pinned him against the wall of the building with one forearm and pulled his revolver with the other. "You're going to answer every question I ask, and you're going to do it slow." The man swallowed hard. "I was paid. That's all I know. I didn't bury her, I just moved her. Someone else handled the rest." "Who paid you?" "I never got a name." Abram pressed harder. "Swear to God," the man choked. "He wore gloves. Gave me the locket, said to hang it around her neck, said it'd make someone look harder if she was ever found." Abram's stomach turned. "You're not leaving this town," he said. "I got no reason to." "Good. Because if you try, you won't make it past the blacksmith's gate." He cuffed him to the bench outside the jail, posted Deputy Harlan to watch him, then returned to the general store where Sariah stood pale and unmoving. "He's not going anywhere," he said. She nodded, but her hands trembled as she gathered the flour sack. "I didn't remember his face until I heard his voice," she whispered. Then it came back. The smell of the wagon canvas, the lurch of the wheels. "He said I'd be asleep by the time we reached the hills, that I wouldn't feel a thing." Abram took the sack from her, tucked it under one arm. "You're not alone now," he said. "And you're not going to disappear again." She looked up at him, eyes wet but steady. "I believe you," she said. That night, she didn't wait for him to speak first. After supper, she reached across the table, took his hand, and said, "Tell me something you've never told anyone." He was quiet a moment. "When I was 16, he said, "I ran off for 2 weeks, thought I'd find work in Salt Lake. Got picked up 3 towns out by a cattleman who figured I looked too clean to be honest. He wired my mother. She rode all the way out and gave me the only beating I ever earned." Sariah's brow lifted, surprised. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone that?" He shrugged. "Didn't want to think about how scared she must have been." She smiled then, faint but warm. "Tell me something else," she said. He did. And then another. Until the lantern burned low and the wind outside shifted to stillness. And when she reached for him later, no fear, no hesitation, he met her there, without question. The sky turned amber behind the hills as Abram finished loading the last of the rye grain into the shed. He closed the door with a heavy thud, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked toward the house. The kitchen lamp burned low behind the window pane, flickering gold. Sariah had started baking again. She'd found his mother's old tin of receipts tucked behind a row of mason jars, and now the kitchen smelled like nutmeg and molasses most evenings. He stepped onto the porch just as the door opened. "I found something," she said, holding a folded piece of paper. Her apron was dusted with flour and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. "It was in the pocket of that wool coat hanging by the cellar." He took it from her. The paper was yellowed, edges curled, the ink smudged where water had bled through. A list, names mostly, some crossed out, a few with dates beside them. "Any of these familiar?" he asked. She leaned against the door frame. "One, the second name Emmeline Hatch. She taught me to sew back in Kansas. Said she was heading west to teach school near Fort Bridger. I never heard from her again." Abram folded the paper and tucked it into his vest. "We'll ride out there next week. Ask around." Her brow furrowed. "You don't think this is finished, do you?" I think a man doesn't bury a woman alive without a reason, and I think he's done it before." She nodded, jaw set. That night they sat on the floor by the hearth, the fire throwing soft light across the rug. Sariah traced one of the hand-carved patterns in the wood with her fingertip. "I used to think I'd marry a farmer," she said. "Someone who'd never leave the county line. Someone who smelled like wheat and sweat and always had dirt under his nails." Abram looked at her, waiting. "But now," she continued, "I think I never really wanted that. I just wanted to be still, safe." He watched her fingers pause on a knot in the grain. "And now?" he asked. She met his eyes. "Now I want the kind of life where I know who I am, where I wake up next to someone who sees all of me. Not just the quiet parts." He reached for her hand, slid his fingers through hers. "I see you," he said. Her breath caught, but she held his gaze. "I see you too." The next week brought snow again, unexpected and heavy. It kept them from riding to Fort Bridger, but it didn't stop the questions. Sariah spent hours sorting through the letters in Abram's desk drawer, searching for handwriting that matched the note, for names repeated. Abram spoke with the town's undertaker, who admitted he hadn't dug the grave marked Sariah Elsden. He'd assumed the church had handled it. "We'll go as soon as the road clears," Abram said one morning, watching Sariah from the doorway as she stitched a patch onto his coat. "But I want to ask you something first." She looked up, needle paused. "Why Cheyenne?" he asked. "Of all places." She pulled the thread through and tied it off before answering. "My uncle went there after the war, said they needed women who could raid and take shorthand. I figured I'd learn, maybe start over. No one knew me there." Abram stepped inside, took the coat from her lap and folded it. "You don't have to disappear to start over," he said. "I'm beginning to believe that," she replied. The next morning brought clear skies and hard ground. They packed a satchel and set out early, the sun just breaking over the horizon. The ride to Fort Bridger took most of the day. When they arrived, Sariah kept her hat low and her voice quieter than usual. They asked at the mission school, the trading post, the garrison stables. No one had seen Emmeline Hatch, but an older woman behind the mercantile counter remembered a girl by that name. "Sweet thing," she said, folding muslin onto the shelf. "Stayed here a few weeks. Then she left with a man headed east." "You know where they went?" Sariah asked. The woman shook her head. "Only that he said he was a doctor, had a wagon marked with a red cross. Emmeline seemed unsure, but he said he needed help with patients." Abram exchanged a glance with Sariah. Back on the trail, she rode in silence for a long time. "Do you think she's buried too?" she asked finally. He didn't answer right away. "I think we're not dealing with someone who leaves much behind." That night they camped beneath a ridge of wind-worn stone. Sariah sat with her back to a cedar stump, her knees drawn close, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. "You think I'll ever stop being afraid something's coming?" she asked. Abram stirred the coals, then set the iron coffee pot in place. "I don't think fear goes away. I think we just learn to live louder than it." She studied him across the flames. "Would you have wanted this life if things had gone differently?" she asked. He leaned back, arms crossed over his chest. "I used to think I'd marry a girl from town. Someone who knew my mother, grew up knowing my name. Now I think I was waiting for someone who didn't need any of that to see me right." She smiled, slow and certain. "I see you." He reached across the fire and touched her ankle just above the boot. "I know," he said. When they rode home the next day, the wind came up behind them, carrying the scent of thawed grass and pine. She leaned forward in the saddle, eyes ahead, hair loose beneath her hat. And Abram knew, with the kind of knowing that didn't come from words, that they were already building a life that would hold. One stitched from shared silence, slow trust, and the kind of love that came not in grand declarations, but in the quiet choosing of each other, again and again. The first letter came folded inside a catalog envelope, postmarked from Denver and addressed only to the lawman Sweetwater. Abram found it waiting on his desk one morning beside a stack of tax notices. The handwriting was narrow and sloped, unfamiliar. There was no return name. He opened it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. Inside was just one line written in black ink. She wasn't the first. She won't be the last. He read it twice before setting it down. Sariah stood in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the morning wind lifting the ends of her hair. "What is it?" He passed it to her without a word. She read it, lips pressed thin, then looked up. "Same hand as the list," he nodded. They didn't speak again until they were back at the house, the lamp lit low on the kitchen table, the letter laid flat between them. "There's no stamp," she said, tracing the edge with a fingertip. "It was handed over the counter, or dropped in a chute," he offered. Either way, someone went to Denver to mail it or had someone do it for them. She sat back. Could be meant to scare us off, or to keep us digging. The wind pushed against the windows just then, a low moan threading through the cracks. Abram got up, checked the latch, then turned to her. "I want you to stay at the house tomorrow," he said. "I'll speak with the postmaster, see if he remembers anything unusual. I'm coming with you." He waited. "I don't want to be kept safe," she said. "I want to be part of this, all of it." He didn't argue. The next morning, they rode into town before the sun touched the chapel steeple. The postmaster, a man named Reed with a crooked gait and a habit of whistling between words, leaned against the counter as Abram showed him the envelope. "Denver mark, but this came in on the freight wagon," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "No one handed it to me. Was tied with a string around a stack of general mail. Came in 3 days ago." "Anyone new riding freight?" Abram asked. Reed considered. "Elias Dorman switched teams last week. Drives westbound now. Young fellow took his place, quiet, keeps his hat down." "Name?" Reed shook his head. "Ain't heard it. Might be he's just filling in." Abram nodded, then turned to Sariah. She was watching the door. Outside, the street was warming with morning children darting past with pails. A ranch hand tying a mule to the rail beside the grocer's. But Sariah's eyes were fixed on a man stepping off a bay horse beside the saloon, his coat too fine for the dust, and his boots polished to a shine. "That's him," she said. Abram stepped closer. "You're certain?" She didn't blink. "He was in the back of the wagon. I never saw his face, but I remember the boots." They waited until he entered the saloon, then crossed the street. Inside, the light was dim and sharp with the smell of old whiskey. The man sat at the far end of the bar, sipping from a tin cup, hat still on. Abram approached slow, Sariah at his shoulder. "You new to Sweetwater?" he asked, resting one hand on the bar. The man turned, eyes pale and unreadable. "Just passing through." "Where from?" "Colorado Springs. Looking for work." "What kind?" "Whatever pays." Abram watched him for a beat longer, then nodded to the barkeep. "He's done drinking." The man set his cup down, jaw tight. Sariah didn't speak, just stared until he looked away. Outside, Abram walked him to the jail. "You're gonna sit a while, we've got questions." "I haven't done anything," the man said. "No," Abram agreed. "But I think you know who has." Back in the house that night, Sariah sat in the rocking chair near the hearth, her fingers wrapped around a mug of warm cider. Abram stood at the window, watching the dark. "He's not the one," she said. "He's part of it, but he's not the one who put me in the ground." Abram turned. "You sure?" "I heard the man who gave the orders. He had an accent, southern, older, called me darlin' like it was a curse." He crossed to her, crouched down beside the chair. "I'll find him," he said. She touched his cheek, her palm warm. "We'll find him." They spent the next morning going through the old town records Abram had pulled from the courthouse cellar land sales. wagon permits, marriage applications. Sariah found a name that matched the signature on the freight registry, Leland Thorne. Registered as a physician, no fixed residence, but he'd signed a medical license renewal in Cheyenne 5 months earlier. Leland Thorne, she said aloud. The handwriting matches the list. Abram folded the paper. Then we know who we're after. Sariah stood, straightened her shoulders. Let's end it. He watched her, a quiet pride settling in his chest. We will. That night he brought her the locket. She hadn't worn it since the day he pulled her from the grave. It had sat in a drawer beside his mother's hairbrush and an old Bible neither of them ever opened. He placed it in her hand. It's yours, he said. You survived it. You made it mean something else. She opened it, looked down at the tiny photo inside. I'll wear it when we ride to Cheyenne, she said. And when we come back, I'll never take it off again. He reached for her, and she came to him without pause. They didn't speak as they held each other, didn't need to. The fire died down low, and the wind outside shifted, carrying the scent of sage and thawed earth through the cracks. In the hush, he pressed his forehead to hers. You're the strongest thing I've ever known. She smiled against his mouth. Then we match. By the time they reached Cheyenne, the wind had turned sharp again, carrying grit that scraped at their faces and whispered down alleys like a voice trying not to be heard. Abram kept his coat buttoned to the collar, his hat low. Sariah rode beside him without speaking, the locket cold against her skin, hidden beneath her bodice. The town had grown since he'd last seen it, more buildings along the rail line, more men with polished boots and quick eyes. But the courthouse still stood where it always had, square and hunched on the corner of Lincoln and 16th. And that's where they went first. Inside, the clerk, a thin man with a mole under his left eye, led them to a storeroom lined with ledgers. Abram leafed through until his thumb landed on a license for one Leland Thorne, age 57, formerly of Mississippi, granted temporary medical rights in the territory on account of wartime service and prior apprenticeship. Address? Abram asked. The clerk frowned. No permanent one. Says he operates by wagon. There's mention of a patient ledger submitted last month might list where he's been. They found it in a drawer beneath a stack of mineral claims. Sariah turned the pages slowly, her eyes scanning the columns. Here, she said. Fort Bridger, Sweetwater, Laramie. He's been circling. Abram leaned over her shoulder. What's the last entry? She pointed. Riverton, 3 weeks ago. They left the courthouse and rode west, stopping only for feed and a coil of rope. The trail to Riverton ran hard along the river, where the banks brimmed with meltwater and the cottonwoods leaned over the path like they were listening. 2 days later, they found the wagon. It was set back in a grove of aspens, canvas drawn taut, the red cross on its side faded and flaking. A campfire smoldered nearby, and a horse stood tied to a branch, saddle still on. Abram drew his revolver. Sariah stayed behind him, her eyes fixed forward. A man stepped out from behind the wagon. His hair was white at the temples, his coat neat, his mouth narrow. He raised both hands slow. You've come farther than most, he said. You're Leland Thorne, Abram said. The man's gaze slid to Sariah. She wasn't supposed to live. Abram stepped closer. Why? She was chosen. Like the others, quiet women, no ties. Easier that way. Sariah's voice didn't tremble. What were you choosing them for? Study, he said. Preservation. I have theories about the limits of human endurance, how long the body can survive in a suspended state. It's medical work. You buried them, she said. I documented everything. Their responses, their vitals, the time it took for breath to cease. You were an anomaly. Abram raised his weapon. Thorne didn't flinch. You won't shoot me, you're law. I'm a man first, Abram said. And she's mine. They bound him, turned him over to the cavalry outpost near Wind River. There were warrants already, 2 bodies found near Pinedale, another outside Rawlins. The soldiers took him without question. By the time they returned to Sweetwater, the snow had gone for good. Mud clung to the wagon wheels and the air smelled of grass and old pine. Sariah didn't unpack right away. She stood by the barn, looking east, the sun catching in her hair. He came to her, took her hand. "You didn't hesitate," she said. "I knew what had to be done." She turned to him. "So do I." Inside the house, beside the hearth, she reached into her satchel and drew out the list, the one with the names. She laid it flat across the table, then lit a match. Abram watched as the flame took it. When it was gone, she looked at him. "No more graves," she said. He nodded. That evening they rode out to the ridge where the creek bent through the hills. The water was high but calm, and the willows had begun to bud. Sariah stepped down from her saddle, pulled her boots off, and waded in up to her knees. "Come on," she called. He followed, the water cold and clear. She turned to him, smiling in a way he hadn't yet seen, not cautious or brave, just open. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just here with you." Abram took her face in his hands, kissed her slowly. "Then stay," he said. "There's nothing I want more." They married under the cottonwoods behind the house, with only the deputy, the preacher, and the blacksmith's wife to witness. Sariah wore a pale blue dress she'd sewn herself, and Abram had trimmed his beard for the first time in months. She planted a garden that spring, onions, squash, beans, and built a fence around it with lumber he hauled from the mill. They spent their evenings by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his fingers brushing the inside of her wrist. One morning she woke before him, her hand resting lightly on his chest. He opened his eyes to find her watching him. "I used to think I'd never be whole again," she said. "You are," he said. "You're more than whole," she smiled. "So are you." Years passed, but the locket stayed around her neck, worn and bright, its hinge never rusting. She never took it off, not when she was canning peaches, not when she nursed their son beneath the cottonwoods, not when she braided her hair before bed. And every year, on the morning the creek thawed, they would ride to the bend and wade in together, toes in the silt, hands clasped, the water wrapping around them like a promise kept. They never spoke of graves again, only of roots and seasons and the quiet joy of living unafraid. And long after the world moved on, the house stood still, warm with laughter, the windows bright with light. Love, once buried, lived there, fully and forever.